Thank you so much, Fabrice. Moi, je parle français, mais pas très bien. Alors, je suis très heureux que je peux parler en anglais. Someday, though, I wish I could be there in person and in 3 dimensions, as opposed to the 2-dimensional methods of Zoom. Nonetheless, it certainly has given us a great convenience of convening to talk, and actually been a copper lining, I won't say silver lining, to the pandemic that we've all endured. I appreciate you, though, tolerating a talk in English. So I'm talking now, Fabrice, just to make sure that my audio is okay and etc. So I'm seeing you nod, so I think I'm coming through okay. I'm going to suppress the view of myself because there's nothing more self-conscious than watching oneself speak. So I'll do that. Fabrice asked for some remarks about the book, and then to pivot to the particular focus on Biogen's drug aducanumab. And I'll divide my time roughly between those two. And then I'm very mindful too, Fabrice, I think the plan was to open it up for discussion with the group. And that I really would look forward to. There's a real opportunity to meet and speak with you, given your center. If ever there was a disease, a problem that demanded a multidisciplinary approach, it is the disease of Alzheimer's, or the problem of Alzheimer's. And I use Alzheimer's as a placeholder, for want of a better word, to capture the many different diseases that cause a once abled brain to become disabled, where of course the operative term there is dementia. And I do know in your country, for example, the term dementia is so stigmatizing that it's rarely used, and instead the word Alzheimer's is used as a kind of umbrella term.
Oh, yes.
To actually capture all of the different diseases that can cause a brain over time to go from being able to disabled. And such as Lewy body disease, frontotemporal lobar degeneration, vascular disease, TDP-43, a part of the pun because it's called late, L-A-T-E, in the United States and America. But I bring this up because, just to begin almost with epistemology, and we can come back to this, I do think that the field of Alzheimer's is haunted by nomenclature, meaning I think what has allowed cancer and heart disease to advance very swiftly is not simply spectacular progress in the science, but spectacular progress in culture, namely language, namely a coherent language with which to sort of frame what's the problem and what we're going to do about it. So you say cancer and it captures every organ in the body that can have mitotic figures, and no one debates that. You say heart disease and it captures the various problems of lipids and hypertension and blocked arteries and heart failure and whatnot. But you say Alzheimer's and you find yourself going down, and I'll use an English expression, what we call a rat hole. Namely, are we talking about the biologic disease? Are we talking about the syndromic presentation in dementia? Are we talking about the syndromic presentation in mild cognitive impairment? Or are we using it as a general umbrella term to sort of capture all the various things that can cause a brain to go wrong, independent of dementia? And you get my point. So we'll come back to that, I think, later, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. So let me start with the book a bit, and thank you so much, Fabrice, for your very kind words about the problem of Alzheimer's. And the subtitle of the book, I think, tries to capture what its message is, which is, simply put, I'll expand it, that once upon a time, not that long ago, the beginning of the 20th century, Alzheimer's disease, the idea of Alzheimer's disease was a rare disease. And then over the course of the 20th century, science and culture together transformed this rare disease into an extremely common disease. Almost overnight, and you can almost date the events around the 1970s in the States. And then fairly rapidly, politics turned it into a crisis. And that's the story of I think, of Alzheimer's. And it is, in my book, told as a very American story. And yet I do think that most industrialized nations would see bits of their stories reflected in the American story. Without rambling, but at the risk of rambling, I think your country has been very interesting over the last 2 decades with taking on the problem of Alzheimer's. And I'll cite 2 examples, and I almost put them in the book, but for reasons I won't get into, I didn't. The creation of the network of Alzheimer's centers throughout all the, I think you call them districts in France, the sort of way this country is divided up, with specially referral centers, and did that fairly quickly, something we never have done in America. And also your decision to simply not pay for donepezil and to say, well, the funds that would be used for donepezil, which is also sold as Aricept, we're going to use to create those centers. Something like that would never happen in America. I mean, that would just, you couldn't even, you don't have the political structure to have that kind of just sort of decisive decision making. All right, so I just wanted to offer a bit how the book is American, although I think what you will find when you read it is your story is reflected in the American story. But I won't start with America, actually. I'm going to start with Germany. And the story of Alzheimer's disease as it develops in the early 20th century is a very German story. And it begins with a very notoriously well-known German psychiatrist and neuropathologist named Alois Alzheimer's, for whom, of course, the disease would be named after. And we all know about his famous case report, An Unusual Disease of the Cerebral Cortex, presented in 1906, published in 1907, and often viewed as, quote, the first case of Alzheimer's disease. And when I trained, and most were given this story, that what Alois Alzheimer's said was, there's this disease of sort of non-aged people that is this plaque thing, and it's Alzheimer's, and that's what Alzheimer's is. And then the very wise physicians later in the 20th century said, no, people who have senility, they also have Alzheimer's. And it's a sort of very linear arc of progress of science that sort of, corrected Alois Alzheimer's error. In fact, none of that is the case. None of that, I think, is correct. And the historical record, I think, makes it very evident. And so let me tell you what I think the real story is. So Alois Alzheimer's publishes his case report of August Dieter. And it's a quirky case report because it's more notable for what he doesn't say than what he says. So what he doesn't say is, this is what I think is causing her problem. And her problem was that she, for all intents and purposes, looked like, performed like, presented like a person with senility. And at that time, dementia senilis, the German term, described an older adult with dementia for whom you couldn't say the other common causes of why people developed what looked like dementia were present. Syphilis being one of them, chronic developmental epileptic type problems that haunted a person throughout their life course that finally end another one, obvious stroke and hemiparesis and other kinds of clear vascular presentations, chronic alcohol, in other words, chronic alcohol use, all those things sort of were, if they weren't present and an older adult came in forgetful, confused, and agitated, they said, well, that's senility. And the key thing there was senility meant just what the aging brain sadly ends up like. And in medicine, even in the early 20th century, especially before the modern era, the current contemporary postmodern era, to say that something was caused by aging immediately dismissed the biomedical model, immediately dismissed the attention of medicine from the problem, except perhaps for the management of extreme symptoms that were uncontrollable through non-medical approaches. Well, what Alois Alzheimer's was fascinated about with his case of August Dieter was that she was not elderly. She was all but 56 years old. And yet she seemed like someone who had, quote, senility. And she didn't seem like someone who had syphilis, chronic epilepsy, or other sort of neurological problems over the life course that sort of ended in this way, and all the other sort of diseases that explained it. And that's how he ends his case report, which is, we should not be content with the current categories to explain our problems, but be open to creating new categories. And this is a very important point, because what he was saying was, she doesn't seem to fit our current nosologic categories. He wasn't saying this is this disease called Alzheimer's disease or whatever. And in fact, his mentor, Emil Kraepelin, would situate his disease amongst the diseases that cause senile dementia. And the reason was because these psychiatrists in Germany were also skilled as neuropathologists. To be a German psychiatrist, and it was distinctly German, you also were a neuropathologist. They didn't call themselves that, but it was understood that a psychiatrist was also skilled at harvesting the brain of his deceased patient, and they were all generally men, slicing it, staining it, and using some of the very contemporary for the time and very advanced technologies of staining and light microscopy. And so what Alzheimer's and other researchers were doing, all German, was staining these brains and seeing these plaques that they were consistently seeing in both the senile and the pre-senile brains. And one of the researchers who led this work, who is forgotten in history and deserves to be restored, is a Czech German named Oskar Fischer. And Oskar Fischer really was the leader in studying those plaques that Alois Alzheimer's observed in the brain of August Dieter. In fact, his work was so respected for the quality of his microscopy, his meticulous case descriptions, and assembled case reports, that the plaques were actually called Fischer's plaques. They were named after Fischer, and they would call them Fischer plaques. And if you show Oskar Fischer's hand microscopy drawings to a contemporary neuropathologist and say, what do you think of these? They'll say, those are really well done micrographs of senile and neuritic plaques. The quality rivals contemporary work done with photographs. That's how good Oskar Fischer's work was. And in fact, by 1911, Alois Alzheimer's was writing a new case report talking about the Fischer's plaques, and would make a very provocative statement in his second case report that he could see no difference between the senile dementias and these pre-senile dementias, and questioned whether that division made any sense anymore, and called for more research to better understand what were these Fischer's plaques doing that caused many older people and some younger people, meaning not elderly, to develop this progressive dementing disorder. And so by 1911, 1912, these German psychiatrists and neuropathologists were essentially questioning the idea of senile dementia caused by aging, and instead beginning to entertain the idea that there might be a disease at work in these brains of these 60, 70, and 80-year-old people. And in fact, at the hospital, the medical records that have been found in the basement, you can see physicians using the word Alzheimer's disease to diagnose elderly individuals who have dementia, who present like August Dieter did, and had autopsies. And Lara Koik in Berlin, a historian, did this elegant work looking at these historical records. And I think it's safe to say that had these German scientists continued their work, I can't give you the exact date, but I think that we would have been thinking sometime by the middle of the 20th century that older adults who develop memory problems, forgetfulness, otherwise language problems, confusion, aren't suffering from aging, therefore something that medicine really doesn't care about, but that they have a disease. But of course that didn't happen. By 1950, Alzheimer's disease was forgotten. It was obliterated from our attention. Why? And this is where we see the first bits of how culture and politics have disrupted progress in this disease, created the problem of Alzheimer's. I've been repeatedly saying how these were German neuropathologists, German psychiatrists. I mentioned that Oskar Fischer was forgotten. We, of course, all know what happened to Germany in the early 20th century. By 1914, Germany went to war. Europe went to war. It was going to be, like many wars, a quick and easy war that would end within a few months. The rest, of course, is history. It was neither quick nor easy. It was brutal. It was awful. It destroyed Germany. It reorganized Europe in ways that resonated for the rest of the 20th century. Many of these German neuropathologists, psychiatrists were either killed in the war, or if they survived it, faced the country in social and economic disarray. And the research needed to do dementia research is, of course, very expensive. You need to have patients in an asylum where you can follow them, record their case, get their brain, have the light microscopic lab to study them. It was very expensive research. Asylums were very expensive, and the asylum system began to fall apart after the First World War. Germany began to fall apart after the First World War. Moreover, Germany changed in ways that were deeply disturbing. Oskar Fischer, for example, was a German. He was Czech, but he was also a Jew and a socialist. And by the early 1920s, he would lose his faculty position at the German University in Prague because of his politics and his religion. And by the 1930s, now long out of academic research, because he lost his position in the early 20s, so no longer doing any research, when Prague became part of the expanded German state, would be imprisoned by the Nazis in Theresienstadt prison, would die a year later and would be forgotten. His story, I think, is emblematic of how Germany essentially wrecked the science that was distinctly German. It only gets worse. Emil Kraepelin, who of course self-destroying his reputation. Kraepelin would embrace eugenic theories of disease. He would mentor Ernst Rudin to take over his job after Kraepelin retired and died. Ernst Rudin would become the Reichskommissar Führer for hygiene in the Reich, Germany, and would advance eugenic theories of disease and all but destroy, if you will, the reputation of Kraepelin. Kraepelin was in his time one of the most prominent psychiatrists, not just in Germany, but the world. His reputation, though, was so sullied and ruined that he would be forgotten. I'll give you one final chapter in that early history where how culture and politics has so dramatically affected progress in Alzheimer's. The First World War transformed the way the balance among competing theories to explain illnesses of the brain, diseases of the brain. Prior to the First World War, Sigmund Freud and others were championing a concept of disease based on not pathology, biology, but rather psychodynamic theory of brain disease. They essentially rejected the idea that you could explain brain disease on the basis of pathology, but rather on the basis of psychodynamics. Now, I'm not arguing that one theory is right or wrong, and certainly I think both theories have their credibility. Well, the First World War, in addition to destroying the progress of biological psychiatry, as we would now call it, would also champion the progress of biopsychosocial or psychodynamic psychiatry. And the reason is because you had all of a sudden hundreds of thousands, quite literally, if you will, hundreds of thousands of young, otherwise healthy men who had fought in the war, who now were quite ill from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They bore no physical signs of illness, that is to say, head injury, etc., to explain their many signs and symptoms. And so they gave credence, justifiably, to the concept that psychological strain, psychological stress, the witnessing of the horrors of World War I, and they truly were horrors of a mechanized warfare never seen before in the history of humans, would cause someone to develop illness. And so the French theory largely about psychosexual traumas, championed by Freud and Carl Jung, would suddenly be vaulted into a position of a legitimate theory to explain a host of problems in humans beyond psychosexual disorders. And indeed, now the story crosses the Atlantic to a victorious America after the Second World War, where American psychiatry would unabashedly, wholeheartedly, and only as in America we do things in our innocence and our enthusiasm, embrace psychodynamic theories of mental illness as the explanation for why people have brain diseases. And so the American Psychiatric Association would go from being a small organization of a few hundred, few thousand physicians to being one of the largest physician organizations by the 1970s, championing a Freudian, albeit an adapted Freudian theory of disease to explain why people have a variety of problems such as depression, anxiety, etc. Neurology would, of course, focus on the lesion, neurological illness was all about the lesion in the brain. And so persons, older adults with dementia, would simply fall between these two disciplines. There was no lesion to be had because, of course, these are diffuse diseases. Psychiatry had no interest in them because they were not amenable to psychotherapeutic approaches. And so they were just sort of left in the bin of, well, that's just aging. It was, of course, all the more complicated because, again, the ability to look at a brain required waiting until someone died to obtain the brain, take it out, slice it, stain it, etc. And neuropathology was not a very, and still remains a fairly small discipline in the spectrum of the disciplines of pathology. And so my point is that by about 1970, what you see is a confluence of events that really have little to do with science per se, but more to do with social, cultural, political, and economic conditions, none of them intentionally saying, let's not figure out why older adults become forgetful, but their net effect was to cause Alzheimer's disease to essentially enter in what some call a dark ages, if you will, of being forgotten. But then something happened, and it happened very quickly and very swiftly, and it is a bit of an American story. And I will offer one picture to help explain that story. And that's this picture here. This is a Google Ngram. So for those who have discovered Google Ngram, there's nothing more fun on a Friday night to pour yourself a glass of Syrah and search on the frequency with which words are used in the English language and discover the trends of how words appear or disappear. So this Google Ngram depicts the time in years 1800 all the way up to the beginning of the 21st century. And it charts the frequency with which two words appear in the English language across over all written sources as the power of Google. The first word in blue is beneficence. And the second word in red is autonomy. And I would like you to see how it's creepy, but right around about the turn of the 20th century, the two terms intersect and then sharply diverge in an almost exponential way. The presence of autonomy in the English language lexicon steadily increases. Now, I would argue that it's the ascendancy of this concept of autonomy as an ethic to help organize how adults should behave that becomes a central cultural event to begin to argue that growing old and essentially losing one's autonomy is normal. I would argue that it begins to sort of subvert the idea that losing autonomy is just part of nature, because now we're beginning to say there's something that we all should be respecting and having. And, you know, if you start to look at some of these points in here, it's around 1960 that I think in my country, for example, not just social and cultural, but even legal structures began to recognize the need to reorganize society. It was no longer acceptable to have separate schools for people on the basis of color of your skin, which is what was the case in America until about 1958. You could have schools where they were for people of color and schools for people of not color. You could have restaurants that did not allow individuals of color to eat. It was the world of segregation. That was unacceptable. It's between 1960 and 1980 that you would see a series of Supreme Court and other rulings that would say it was no longer acceptable on the basis of gender to list jobs in a newspaper. In other words, once upon in the United States, the help wanted ads, as they're called, in the newspaper had jobs for men. That's what they were called, jobs for men. And below it would be listed jobs for men and jobs for women. And a woman couldn't apply for a man's job. And of course, a man couldn't apply for a woman's job. The Supreme Court in 1971 declared that unconstitutional. I realize those kinds of stories, what do they have to do with Alzheimer's disease? And I would submit they have a lot to do with it, because by 1980, I would argue, it just became increasingly culturally unacceptable to say that losing your autonomy is something that is just normal. It's unacceptable if you're a woman or a black or queer, and it's unacceptable if you're older. And so I think that's one of the cultural transformations that led us to say that getting old and getting forgetful shouldn't be thought of as normal. Now, of course, it helps when medicine marches in and says, well, when you look at the brains of those people that are forgetful, they have all these amyloid plaques in them. And those plaques are probably what's causing it. So I can give you a disease model to explain this now, if you will. I can give you pathology. And that's exactly what Robert Katzman's 1976 short 1,200-word essay in what was then the Archives of Neurology in 1976 argued. Dr. Katzman argued that it made no sense anymore to distinguish between pre-senile dementia caused by Alzheimer's and senile dementia caused by aging. And his argument relied on biology. They both had the same plaques in them, but infused into Katzman's essay, not explicitly, is this value of autonomy, I would argue. And in fact, Katzman himself had personal witness to Alzheimer's disease because his beloved mother-in-law had Alzheimer's disease. And so he himself personally witnessed what the disease was like. And he himself in interviews later would talk about the strain it placed upon his wife's family, her husband, his father-in-law, to care for her. He personally witnessed how costly it was to the family to find care and give her care. And so this introduces another theme depicted on this graph, which is another engram, if you will. Again, now I've plotted it from the early 20th century to this current century. And what I've depicted is, again, in the English language, the frequency of documents that talk about Alzheimer's. And look at that. It's right around 1976 when Katzman's essay comes out that you suddenly start to see the word Alzheimer's and its variations, Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's dementia, take off. And then look at this word that comes about 5 years later and parallels it. It's the word caregiver. I think this is a very important historical moment because what is going on here is a carving out through nomenclature of a role that's been timeless in human history. People have been caring for other humans since the beginning of time. In the Old Testament, the book of Ruth is the story of Ruth, who is caregiving for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Both women are widowed, meaning without a husband. And Naomi says to Ruth, oh, you'll go back to your village and find a new husband. Just leave me alone. I'll figure it out on my own. And she says, no, wherever you go, I go. Wherever you are, I am. And swears herself into care to her mother-in-law. Nowhere in the book of Ruth is she called her mother-in-law's caregiver. She's just a good daughter-in-law doing what good daughter-in-laws do for their mother-in-laws, and so daughters for their mothers, etc. It's only until the last quarter of the 20th century that this idea of caregiver becomes demarcated as a separate, distinct role. Is embedded, I think, in second wave feminism as well as economics, with the recognition that the labor of the household is a job in its own right, similar to the labor of someone in an office or factory. And indeed, the story of why Alzheimer's becomes a crisis is really told through caregiving. Because what we tell when we talk about the costs of Alzheimer's is we talk about the cost of the time and effort spent by an individual to provide care. The triple-digit billion-dollar cost of this disease is a story of monetizing the time that a daughter, a husband, a wife, a daughter-in-law spends to care for their relative or pays someone else to do that. That's how you arrive at the tremendous cost of Alzheimer's disease to a country. You monetize the cost of caregiving. And so this role that was traditionally baked into the role of a family is now called out as a distinct and separate role with a name, caregiver. And it's given and you can now count them using criteria to define who's a caregiver, which itself is a series of choices. And of course, then assign a wage to the labors of caregiving, and that allows you to arrive at the cost of the disease. And so all these, by 1980, you've now set up the conditions to have transformed what was once part of aging and simply part of the family doing what families do into the disease called Alzheimer's, and the burden, if you will, faced by the family as caregivers to care for these patients. And now politics intrudes. And in the United States, this politics would be told through a story of contentious fights over the role of the state in the American family. the role, if you will, of welfare, which is the term in America that immediately charges a debate as being, already frames the politics of the debate. And a key event would occur in America in 1980. At the same time that the Alzheimer's Association was formed in 1980 to raise awareness about this disease, to promote research, etc. The Alzheimer's Association was a self-help group. It was not created by physicians. It was not created by professionals of any kind. It was created by families who realized the system was incapable of caring for their relatives. It was truly a self-help group created by patients, by families. At the same time that the Alzheimer's Association was created in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States of America. And Ronald Reagan would go into office with a very clear mandate. He felt that the era of big government was over. I hesitated because actually Bill Clinton used that rhetoric in the 1990s, because Bill Clinton would triangulate attitudes of Reaganism into his policies in a kind of radical compromise. I'll develop that more later. Reagan had absolutely no interest in expanding the size or scope of the federal government. If anything, he wanted to cut the size of the federal government. He particularly would cite Medicare and Medicaid as bloated and wasteful and in need of being reformed, which was code for being cut. He desired to devolve most of these roles to the states if possible, which in the United States means essentially let each state figure it out, which in many states means just simply ignore whatever the problem may be. An attitude of cutting taxes, an attitude of shrinking the size of the federal government was not a set of political conditions to take on the needs of America's caregivers. It was not a set of political conditions to create a system of long-term care services and supports for America's caregivers. America right now, unlike your country, unlike Germany, unlike Japan, unlike Sweden, unlike many developed nations, does not have a long-term care social insurance program of any kind. After your illness has been diagnosed and treated for a period of time and requires long-term care, you're on your own as a family to pay for that care, or if you're poor enough, you qualify for Medicaid based on poverty thresholds. The statute for Medicare expressly prohibits paying for what's called custodial care. That's the term in the statute that was written in 1965. It's an ironic term. Custodian in America, custodian in English, is an individual who cleans a building. In other words, after hours goes in and mops the floors, cleans the bathrooms, dusts, vacuums. That's what a custodian does. And the Medicare statute expressly prohibits custodial care. It took a while for that to be interpreted as long-term care services and supports. It's an insulting term for humans, but I think it captures how we're still figuring out what our obligations are to care for other people. And this is, I think, a very interesting next wave topic in caregiving, which is to rethink what caregiving is. It's not simply the physical acts, but there's something going on in caregiving for people with Alzheimer's that has to do with mind maintenance and the preservation and health of the mind. We can certainly talk more about that. And so in America, the story that would continue over the course of the rest of the 20th century was a story of progressive retrenchment and retreat from trying to advance a national program for long-term care social insurance and improving the system of care by, for example, creating a workforce of physicians skilled in diagnosis and treatment. And instead, it would be left, as often is the case in our country and others, frankly, for market forces to work things out. And market forces would not and still do not see a path to making money about this disease. And so the disease sort of languishes in plain sight, despite the millions of people with a healthcare system that simply in our country doesn't recognize the value of diagnosis and treatment. And so, for example, tomorrow I'll go to my memory center to see patients. And I'm able to go to that center and see patients, not because of the ability of myself to recover the necessary revenue to pay for the staff and my colleagues, but because a philanthropist gave us a big pile of money to pay for most of our staff. And we have lots of grants, and so we cross-subsidize our work. And the health system just sort of ignores any loss we face otherwise. And that's at the University of Pennsylvania, I would argue, a pretty decent institution with a fair amount of cash to do things. I'm not saying that I am partially criticizing perhaps my institution, but it's no different than any other institution in the United States in terms of how a memory center is set up. So it's not, I'm not calling mine out as unique, I'm calling it out as sadly all too typical. So let me make a pivot now, I think in the interest of time. Yeah, I think we're about almost a bit of a halfway to the particular story then of aducanumab. Is that a fair pivot now, Fabrice? Yeah, okay, I see you nod.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I started talking about this idea of how market forces really in America are essential for well, let me make a blunt, bold, somewhat provocative statement. In America, and perhaps as well in other countries, a disease doesn't fully exist until it has a business model. And by business model, I mean that given the size and scope of the disease, the costs of diagnosis and treatment at least allow you to break even, if not make some money to help care for people. Now, if the disease is sufficiently infrequent, other diseases, if you will, cross-subsidize, pay for it. It's just part of the wash. But this disease, being as prevalent as it is, of course, doesn't allow that kind of cross-subsidization. And so we simply have a system set up that doesn't provide the necessary diagnostics and care for people complaining of cognitive problems. And in the essay that Fabrice cited, Aducanumab and the Business of Alzheimer's, Some Choice, I began to embrace and engage that sad reality using aducanumab as a springboard. And so let me talk a bit about that. In the days to follow the FDA's decision to approve the drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, which was what the FDA's label said, quite simply and plainly and with no greater detail, I remember many people, even those who opposed the approval and felt it was inappropriate, I remember many people saying to me, well, at least this will start to bring some funds into memory centers. Even the most cynical critics of the decision said that, meaning now you write a prescription, you have to get imaging, you need to have staff to monitor for the side effects, you need help staff to help arrange for the many visits. And with the drug charging $56,000 a year, which was the initial price by Set, you began to see a system set up for funds to flow. And so all of a sudden, memory centers would go from being money-losing operations to be money-making operations, given the presence of this drug. And this was not a sentiment uttered by just the enthusiasts for the drug. It was even said by people who were open critics of the approval, a rueful recognition of that. So that's the system that we're in. Let me now pivot a bit to talk more about aducanumab. Aducanumab is a sad stepchild, I think, in what otherwise was a fairly exciting and remains a fairly exciting, although revolutionary, disturbing, and challenging transformation in the way we think about Alzheimer's disease. Aducanumab is part of a larger story of the biomarker redefinition of the disease. Once upon a time, but not too long ago, the only way you could have Alzheimer's disease was if you had dementia. You could almost simplify that into a simple statement of no dementia, no Alzheimer's. NO, no, non. If you don't have dementia, Alzheimer's. Meaning if you don't have disabling cognitive impairments, and I like that way of thinking about dementia, disabling cognitive impairments, then it's not even worth thinking, it's not even sensible, it made no sense to say, well, what's causing the problem? Because dementia was the clinical diagnosis, and then what you sought was, well, what disease might be causing that diagnosis? And more often than not, we said it was Alzheimer's. The discovery in the year 1999 of the concept of mild cognitive impairment, that is to say, cognitive inefficiencies in the absence of disability, was a wedge that began to undermine that tight model of dementia, Alzheimer's. Because what mild cognitive impairment introduced was the idea that it's possible to have cognitive impairment and be at risk for Alzheimer's if you understood Alzheimer's as being only possible to be diagnosed if you had dementia. But even then, people knew, well, the pathology is kind of present before you have dementia, but of course, we can't see it. We only see it when it becomes manifest. So we sort of accepted that until it's clinically evident, we can't make the diagnosis. The skull is a very difficult barrier with which to get tissue. Moreover, biopsying the brain is simply not a very viable option. MCI began to undermine that. The second event that undermined that type model of dementia Alzheimer's was work done by two very zealous investigators at the University of Pittsburgh, Bill Klunk and Chet Mattis. And they're very interesting men. One's a psychiatrist and the other's a physicist. And they were both interested in using radio-labeled ligands to detect amyloid in the brain of a living human. And what I think is fascinating about their story is that at the time, now we think about that molecular imaging of amyloid as well as tau as being sort of routine. When they pursued this research, it was considered somewhat nutty because the ligand method of radio tracers was supposed to only identify neurotransmitters. And that was what you used this for. And to use it to image pathology was considered like bizarre. And Chet Mattis and Bill Klunk would tell me, like, people say, you can't use radio tracers to detect pathology. It's to detect neurotransmitters. That's not what you're supposed to do. Moreover, imaging the garbage cans seemed like uninteresting work. And it's a very interesting story of two men, and they were men, whatever, but two that just wouldn't stop. And they just kept at this research despite multiple challenges. And the other story I'll give you about their work, and it's sort of an interesting story of kind of the, if you will, the culture of science, is, and it remains a problem in the Alzheimer's field, the enslavement to the mouse models. So Alzheimer's can be engineered in mice by inserting dominant genes into the mice, and they'll start to produce amyloid. And those mice models have their own kind of business because mice are expensive creatures, and the labs to maintain mice are very expensive, much like the asylums of early Germany. And so there's this whole industry of the mouse model that sustains itself through very, grants and other things. And so the transition oftentimes in Alzheimer's research from basic science to bench is the leap from mice to men, quite literally. And the problem that many recognize is that the mouse models really aren't, if you will, perfect reproductions of the human disease. The amyloid that is formed in mice is very different than the amyloid that's formed in humans and in the way it behaves. And when Bill Klunk and Chet Mattis did their work, they of course had to use mouse models first before they injected their tracer in humans. Well, when they injected the tracer in mice, it was completely inert. Nothing happened. They didn't detect any amyloid. And they knew these mice had amyloid because they're engineered to have brains full of amyloid. By all the rules of normal science, they should have stopped. They should have said, it doesn't work, don't go to humans. But they didn't. They actually injected it into humans. And then they make light of this when they talk, it was okay, whatnot. But you could tell that they knew how transgressive this was because they went to Sweden to do the research. They didn't do it in the States. The human research was done in Sweden because in Sweden they had much laxer regulatory requirements. They could not have done this work in the States because the FDA would have said, you don't have adequate data to show it could be injected in a human yet. But Sweden was more tolerant, and the rest is history. And the history is the creation of radio-labeled ligands that can image the pathology of Alzheimer's in a living human. And that was revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. You cannot underestimate the revolutionary transformation that occurred when you took what was once a ghoulish disease, meaning you had to die to learn whether you had Alzheimer's, because only then could you do a neuropathologic examination of the brain. But of course, you're dead by then, so that's why it's a bit ghoulish, right? You transformed what was a ghoulish diagnosis, I can only tell you what you have until you die, into a diagnosis that you could make now in a living human. And if you fast forward to about 2015, that's the state where the field is in, that we can image both amyloid and tau, as well as using MRI technology, neurodegeneration, such that you can arrive at a fairly good biological identification that someone is experiencing neurodegeneration and it's being caused by these these proteins are prevalent. I walked away from cause because we'll get back to amyloid and aducanumab in a minute. And so the field has recognized that we can now redefine Alzheimer's disease as well as any of these other diseases for which we can detect the pathology in life. And this is this idea, if you will, of a biomarker-based definition of Alzheimer's as opposed to a clinical definition. This is this idea of preclinical Alzheimer's, if you will, of diagnosing the disease prior to even mild cognitive impairment. And the progress that was being made in that field, I think, was actually quite exciting. Now, there's one aspect, and now we're getting into, if you will, the epistemology of how you redefine a disease using pathology. And that's, of course, one of causation. And there's ample data that, for example, a brain full of amyloid can die, and the neuropathologist says, look at all that amyloid. And the neurologist says, he was fine. There's nothing wrong with him. We were following him meticulously every year, and up until his last visit at our center, he was going off on cruises into the Loire Valley, and leading the tour, etc. So didn't have dementia, didn't even have MCI. Well, so which pathologies and how much are explaining the disease, of course, haunts a biological definition of disease. And so a very interesting phenomena occurred in the late 20th century to facilitate the redefinition of a disease on the basis of biology alone, particularly these chronic diseases. And that's the clinical trial. And now let's go back to heart disease. I remember, once upon a time, but not too long ago, an older adult who came to the clinic with a blood pressure that was very high, the top number, the systolic number, 120 over 80, 120 is the systolic number, 80 is the diastolic, systole, diastole. When that top number would be above 140, 150, 160, and you were older, we said that that was aging, that was the response of the aging cardiovascular system to maintain blood flow throughout the body, particularly to the head. And we did nothing. Until a clinical trial was done that lowered those blood pressures using drugs versus a placebo, and showed unequivocally that if you lowered the blood pressure in these older adults, they were less likely to have a heart failure, stroke, or sudden death arrest. And so overnight, what was once upon a time age-related cardiovascular changes became the disease of systolic hypertension in elderly persons. And I think the interesting thing there is that that's an example of a clinical trial that just doesn't simply discover a drug to treat a disease to make people feel better, but it's an example of the clinical trial as an experiment to validate a construct. Elevated blood pressure is a disease because we did an experiment that shows if you lower it, you change the natural history of a human life. And we don't desire to have a stroke or heart attack, sudden death arrest, and so tie all that together, and I've created a disease. But that disease is defined by that experiment of a drug interacting with a biological marker. And so let us now go to aducanumab. We have known since 2009 that aducanumab hoovers up, that's a name in America for a vacuum cleaner, the Hoover vacuum. We have known since 2009 or so that aducanumab clears amyloid from the brain of a human. That's definitively established in the early phase studies. What wasn't so clear was that translated into benefits to patients. There were signals in the early phase study, but even the most enthusiastic critics, supporters of the study, knew that small hint of benefit in the early phase studies needed to be validated. And so we got ourselves to where we are now, the 2 phase 3 studies that were done to show that lowering amyloid translated into benefits to patients. The sad thing about those studies were a number of errors, both forced and unforced, intentional and unintentional, that we can sort of detail, and I won't go into now, that made them essentially uninterpretable, I think, those studies. And this is where things get complicated. But let me, before I talk about that. So biomarker redefinition of Alzheimer's is on the basis of these drug-targeted to biomarker clinical trials. And there are several of those going on now. And the intention of those trials is to say, if I can lower amyloid, does it translate into a patient not getting as sick? And if that's the case, I've now made this tight connection, and I can redefine this disease as amyloid is causing this problem. I could do that with tau. I could do that with amyloid and tau. And all those experiments that are going on, they don't say it that way. It's all about treating patients. But implicit, if not explicit, is this idea of redefining the disease. Let me develop another point around the epistemology of Alzheimer's. Heart disease is a bad disease because you die, and death is bad. Cancer is a bad disease because you die, and death is bad. And I don't think any of us would dispute that a study to test a treatment for heart disease or cancer that measured death as an endpoint is not a valuable study. Or let me rephrase that. I think all of us would agree that a study to test a treatment for heart disease or cancer that measured death would be giving us valuable data. And we would be enthusiastic about a treatment that showed that fewer people died on treatment than not on treatment. I think we would all agree on that and have no problem with that statement. I think many of us, though, would find morally and ethically problematic a study that said, this is a good treatment for Alzheimer's disease because you're less likely to die of the disease. I think many of us would say, you gave them a treatment and you followed them until they died and showed that they were less likely to die of Alzheimer's? Really? I think many of us would sort of walk back from that and say, those last few years are particularly difficult. You're surrounded by a cultural milieu that even talks about death before death with this disease. Alive in body, but not in mind. Now, we can debate, and I do strongly debate, the ethics of that kind of rhetoric, but that rhetoric is there. The first United States government report on Alzheimer's disease, published in 1984, was called Losing a Million Minds. This is a United States government report on Alzheimer's disease. Losing a million minds. But how do you measure a mind? How do you measure that someone is now a 0 on the 0-1 scale if their mind is no longer there? It's easy to say death. That's not a hard measure to dispute, although we could debate definitions of death. But dead is dead and alive is alive. It's a 0-1 event. And so what I'm getting at is one of the, if you will, problems of Alzheimer's that haunts the disease is the problem of what I call a coherent language of benefit. And by coherent language of benefit, I mean death is coherent. A clinical trialist, a doctor, a patient, a family member, a policymaker, they all understand what death is. They don't need to go to a lecture to understand how do you measure death, what is death good, is death bad. So it's a very coherent language. It's like an Esperanto, if you will. But what's the coherent language for Alzheimer's disease? What do you measure to be able to let the trialist, the clinician, the patient, the family member, the policymaker coherently talk about treatment in a way that makes sense across all those communities? And I would argue that that remains a very vexing problem, such that you're almost left in articles of faith, like that the clinical dementia rating scale change of 0.2 points on the scale between drug and placebo is enough to say that this drug is beneficial. Clinicians don't know what the clinical dementia rating scale is, let alone policymakers, let alone families. And so, for example, you saw the Alzheimer's Association, the advocacy group in the United States that fiercely fought for the approval, issue a public relations campaign prior to the approval called More Time. And in this public relations campaign, they said that Americans need more time. Americans living with Alzheimer's need more time. In fact, they need 20% more time. 20% more time. Now, I think, time to what? Time to when? 20% of what? But that's, they're a very clever organization in terms of their marketing and messaging. 20% more time. And indeed, what you see now amongst the companies that are beginning to promote their ideas of their treatments, Biogen, Lilly, is this idea of time. You're seeing more and more images and rhetoric that use time, clocks, It's interesting, many of them go back to mechanical ideas of clocks with like gears and things to try and show time ticking away. But time to what? So the epistemology of Alzheimer's is haunted by these experiments designed, not haunted, but vexed by the complicated experiments needed to show that changing a biomarker makes a difference in clinical course. It's haunted by the lack of a coherent language of benefit. And then finally, I'll wrap up with, it's haunted by a series of cultural and political events that are hidden in plain sight before us. The United States has a national plan for Alzheimer's disease. The goal number one of that national plan is that by 2025, we'll discover a safe and effective treatment. Meaning, we use an engineering metaphor of setting a date to achieve a goal, which of course arguably is a co-opting of engineering rhetoric into biomedical science that involves humans. And I would argue, although no one celebrates 2025 being achieved in 2021, that the desire to achieve that 2025 goal was one of the sort of emotional motivators to have us try to move aducanumab from its study into clinical practice. Moreover, in America, and I think in other countries, and we can certainly talk about this, the role of the Food and Drug Administration is transformed. So historically, it has been known as the agency that assures the health of Americans, the safety of Americans, to make sure that drugs are safe and effective. Its role as a kind of arbiter of safety. That was its traditional role. A variety of regulations, including the regulations that allowed aducanumab to be approved, the accelerated approval, laws such as, quote, right to try, expanded access to people with serious and life-threatening diseases, all of those have begun to undermine the idea that FDA decides something's safe. More and more, what Congress has been telling the FDA is, patients will decide if it's safe and effective. Your job is to make sure the information is credible. Your job is to regulate information and the credibility of information. And I think thinking about FDA as an information production agency is probably a better way to think about it than an agency that judges whether something's safe and effective, meaning it has to decide whether information is credible, certain, and trustworthy. Taken in from that perspective, the approval of aducanumab was a total disaster. FDA and Biogen had overly close relationships, dating back several years before the filing even. The hearing that was held to review the evidence was a very one-sided hearing that ignored the recommendations of both FDA's statisticians and their advisors. FDA said they listened to the voice of the patient. Who would deny the need to do that? And their listening to the voice of the patient was a meeting on January of 2021 with 6 patients and 2 caregivers convened by the Alzheimer's Association. There's no transcript, no outcomes of that meeting. Think about it. 8 people gave voice to the FDA about the experience of Alzheimer's and their willingness to take risk. I would argue in the world of social science that we would not accept testimonials from 8 people as credible data to make a decision about the approval of a drug if we wanted the patient voice. I would argue that we would engage in more rigorous methods to better understand the patient perspective on an uncertain, risky drug for the treatment of their disease. And in fact, FDA has guidance on doing that kind of research. They just didn't follow it for this drug. And so I do think going forward in the sort of epistemology of Alzheimer's, which is about drug studies being wrapped up in regulatory bodies, one has to really revisit sort of what are the standards to establish knowledge as credible, trustworthy, certain, such that it should be put out in a label for a drug company to market, for doctors to look at, and for patients to look at and take. So with the remaining time for questions, let me now stop. Again, I thank you for this opportunity. I look forward someday to maybe coming there and meeting you all. It'll be a lot of fun, and vice versa. If your travels take you here, we have a great department of medical ethics and health policy, and we'd love to host visitors, as well as, of course, our Alzheimer's Center has a very robust group of folks working together with me working in these spaces. So maybe this could be the beginning, if you will, of a conversation and not the end. So Fabrice, let me turn it over to you and your colleagues for discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. Of course, you will be welcome in Paris when you want, and of course, we will visit your center if we come to the US.